Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to I'm losing count now, seventh or eighth webinar that we've delivered on behalf of the East Midlands Growth Hub Cluster, so Business Lincolnshire, Business Gateway, and D2N2 Growth Hubs. Today we're going to be talking about managing risk and getting paid when trading internationally. So our focus shifts for the next 2 to 3 sessions away perhaps from EU exit and more into generic export topics, and then we revert back. I'll show you the extended timeline in a second for webinars that are coming up. So in terms of an agenda for today, we'll just cover off a little bit about the EU exit support programme. And that extended webinar program, if you like. And then we'll talk about what exporters say in relation to risk associated with export and their concerns around getting paid. And then we're going to cover off as we go through mitigating some of those risks. So doing thorough market research and the kind of things to look out for when researching international markets, particularly those emerging markets that are very high growth but also high risk, and the kind of due diligence that we need to do before breaking into those. And then we'll be looking at the various different methods of payment to mitigate your risk as well. So there are a number of different ways of being paid when exporting, and we're going to look in detail at some of those. And then because export is such an exhilarating journey, never 2 days the same, overseas expansion planning is so important to make sure that you mitigate your risks when breaking into those new markets. And I'll share some of the kind of methodologies that we have used over the last 25 years. That seems like a long time. And we'll cover off contracts and T's and C's as well. And then, as usual with all of these webinars, there'll be additional sources of support and information at the back that you can refer back to. So some URLs for useful sites. So just covering off the EU exit support programme. So we've been pretty much robustly and shall I say consistently supporting East Midlands businesses for the last 6 months around EU exit. And so we've had these topical webinars that have been running. And we've also had the dedicated one-to-one support, which is that dedicated support where we talk about individual companies' unique challenges posed by EU exit. And then we issue targeted action plans that help them overcome some of these challenges that they're facing. So in terms of the newly announced webinars, so we've got Understanding Rules of Origin. We have Understanding the New Regulatory Landscape, because obviously now that we are out of the EU, we're now in a position whereby depending on the sector and the products that you're placing onto the market, you're probably complying with 2 different regulatory regimes and complying with 2 different regulatory bodies, both EU and then GB equivalents. I say GB because, as we know from previous webinars, Northern Ireland remains closely aligned with the EU in terms of regulation and compliance. So we're really just talking about England, Scotland and Wales. Overcoming new complexities in B2C sales. So the withdrawal of the UK from the EU VAT directive is causing a lot of pain around those sales to non-VAT registered entities in the EU. So those consumers and charities and so on. Also our withdrawal from the e-commerce directive as well is causing pain in terms of compliance with local market regulations, so those local jurisdictions within member states. And then the final one is, what do services companies need to do to optimally adjust? So the trading cooperation agreement that was signed and released on Christmas Eve impacts all 4 methods of service delivery, really. And services were left a little bit high and dry, to be honest, in terms of the preparation for Brexit. So much of it was on goods focused businesses. So it's really important that we help services companies to adjust to this new way of trading with the EU. It has undoubtedly become more difficult So it's really important that they understand, the entry requirements for different countries depending on the purpose of their visit, and also how the new regulation relates to them being able to actually apply their service in that particular country. So that should be a really good one. As always, the link to register for both the one-to-ones and the webinars is here. So it's just an Eventbrite link, and sign up to the webinars, and similarly just choose a date and time that works for you for the one-to-one support. So moving on to what exporters say, and like I say, there are, it's a really thrilling journey. There are no 2 days the same. I've been in international trade for some 25 years now, and I absolutely love it, and I hope my passion comes across when I talk to clients about it. But some of the benefits or some of the rationale for exporting, are around expanding your customer base. So obviously, however successful you are in your domestic market, your sales will plateau at some point, because you'll saturate that market. So export enables you to expand that customer base, and as a result increase those revenues and profit. It provides for more consistent revenue. So if you imagine, for example, that you are in a seasonal business, and you have peaks and troughs, so perhaps your sales peak in the summer, then having the ability to export to other markets where their climates and seasons are different to us can actually enable you to flatten that peak and trough, which is a desire for a number of companies, to be honest, have more of that consistent revenue. Diversification and adaptation and innovation and so on, that's all tied up when we start mixing in circles with other international players, other more local players. We really have to up our game and stay on our feet with regard to staying relevant in the customer's eyes. So it poses a lot more challenges, but also rewards and benefits linked to being able to diversify and adapt our products and services to meet those local market requirements. Obviously, you're spreading risk, so you're reducing the dependency on your domestic market, so on the UK. So should your UK market, be subject to a slight downturn, I appreciate nobody would have had COVID-19 in their risk register. That's kind of like a global phenomenon, or a global pandemic that has impacted every country across the globe. But there will be situations whereby your domestic market or your domestic region perhaps isn't faring so well, but there may be other buoyant economies elsewhere around the world. So it reduces your dependency on your domestic market, and longer product life cycles as well. So if you imagine when certainly looking at some of the emerging markets, those developing economies, you might find that you've kind of exhausted your product in your domestic market, but there is still shelf life for it in those emerging markets that are slightly behind us in terms of their industrialization strategy and so on. So it enables you to lengthen those product life cycles. Innovation, we've talked about, obviously economies of scale. It stands to reason, as you increase your production, then you get those economies of scale and increase competitive advantage. Overwhelmingly, when you are dealing with more export markets and you're increasing your customer base, then your competitive advantage increases exponentially also. But what do exporters say regarding the barriers to export? So what are they most afraid of? What do they fear the most? Well, foreign currency fluctuations, obviously, and we saw sterling take an absolute nosedive back in 2016 when the referendum result was announced. So they are something that needs to be considered in your risk mitigation. Documentation also. So I think a number of companies that have perhaps exclusively traded within the EU are now experiencing import and export declaration for the first time, and that can be a little bit daunting. What is an export and import declaration? How do you know what fields or what data needs to go in there, and so on. Also, access to cash and funding. So export is kind of a long game. The returns are typically not as rapid as you'd see in your domestic markets. You need to make sure that you have the cash reserves and the funding available to fund those kind of upfront costs. You know, you may have to invest slightly more in terms of brand awareness and marketing in those overseas markets than you maybe would in your domestic market. So having that cash flow and that funding is quite important, and obviously it's one of the things that that concerns exporters. Extended delivery and extended payment terms. So obviously, you know, when we're dealing with overseas countries, we typically are dealing with lengthier times to get our products to market, and potentially, you know, we're dealing with what we could class as slightly more risky situations with regard to payment. So, you know, it's quite commonplace to request something like cash up front or payment in advance for the first 1 or 2 shipments, but then customers will often ask for lines of credit and more advantageous payment terms, and that can make exporters feel a little bit unnerved because they perceive that as being quite risky. But the truth is there's risk in our domestic market as well, and it's just understanding what the mitigation strategy is. So for every risk there's always a mitigation strategy. And then local culture and legislation. So, you know, understanding the unknown. So, I mean, we've traded within the EU really successfully over the last few decades because we're very culturally aligned to our EU neighbours. There's not such a culture shock. But obviously, as we go further afield, and again, I'm a huge advocate of those emerging markets. You know, that there are disparities in terms of our cultural alignment and so on, and legislation is often quite different as well. But again, it's just a case of, you know, plan and prepare. Nothing is insurmountable. But, you know, with some of those high risk markets, you can find a level of political and economic instability and vulnerability. So those developing and emerging markets quite often have regimes that are quite vulnerable to social unrest and so on. And, you know, they're maybe not as stable as some of the emerging some of the developed markets. But like I say, the returns are far greater. You know, some of those emerging markets are experiencing some 7, 8, 9% GDP growth, whereas the UK and EU stagnated around 1 to 2%. Now, again, we'll talk more on our next session about emerging markets, and we'll examine, you know, some of those high growth markets. But there can be, you know, that kind of political and economic risk can put some of the more faint-hearted exporters off, but it really shouldn't, because there is a mitigation strategy for every concern that you have. Obviously, language barriers. So again, you know, English as a linguist by my undergraduate degree, I come from the perspective that we should speak multiple languages rather than requiring everybody to speak English. But in reality, English is still, you know, widely known as the business language. So whilst there are absolutely language barriers, they're not insurmountable again. And then, you know, seasonality and bad debts, they kind of speak for themselves. So that risk around not getting paid is overwhelmingly something that puts off some exporters from, if not from exporting full stop, but from approaching some of those more rewarding and longer term lucrative emerging markets. So they're kind of like what exporters say in terms of what they fear the most. But in terms of analysing the risks, we're going to go through kind of each one of these in a little bit detail. So when you are conducting your risk mitigation strategy, which I would strongly recommend that you do for each new market that you go into, you need to have a good understanding of what the potential risks are for your entry into that new market. So we're going to take a look at country and political, commercial, regulatory, ethical, and so on. We've broken them down into several different sections. So when we're looking at country and political risks, so risks such as, you know, non-tariff trade barriers, so or central bank exchange regulations, or the ban on sale of certain products in specific countries. So there are several countries like the EU and the UK that have banned products obtained from threatened animal species, for example. There'd be certain things that, you know, looking at a country and a political landscape. There'll be certain things that are just never within your control. You know, there could be trade sanctions, for example, and you must be prepared to abide by them or overcome them in some way. Obviously, you can find out all about such restrictions on the sale of your goods in the tariff, and also checking with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the specific country that you're looking to export to. There's obviously exchange control regulations, so several developing nations operate exchange control regulations that are associated with the flow of money from and to their country. So you need to identify whether those regulations are effective in the country where you intend to trade, because they can obviously delay your payments, if you like. Really important when we're talking about prohibited goods, that you carry out basic research on the import and export allowances. So some products that are prohibited or restricted in some countries, you know, may not be in others. So what's acceptable in China, for example, might not be allowed in New Zealand. Check out all the rules pertaining to your target market in the country that you're interested in carrying out trade with. And whenever you're exporting certain products, it's essential to get them verified so that they can meet the requirements of that country. So, you know, quite possibly licensing or certification might be required. And it's really better to be familiar with all of the rules that that govern your trading globally, rather than facing hurdles at a later stage. So, you know, that research is really, really important. And I've listed here just some of the ones that, you know, we typically look at when we're talking about country and political risk. So, like I said, that economic stability, that legal system. So, you know, whether it operates a robust regulatory system, what's its banking structure like, any kind of tax implications. You know, some countries, in terms of the duty and local taxes that they place on imported goods, just makes it uncompetitive. You know, you could not compete with other local suppliers in those situations. And you know, where companies have, or where countries, sorry, have signed up to the WTO, then that's probably not the case, because they agree to opening their country for third country trade, if you like. But there are still some countries that don't subscribe, and so they can be sometimes harder to penetrate. And again, trade embargoes and sanctions we've talked about. It's just really important that you do that research around the country and the political risk. And you know, you don't have to look much further than Myanmar at the moment to see the military coup that's underway at the moment. Now, Myanmar is a really, really interesting market for UK professional services companies, because they need to invest some 60 billion US dollars in infrastructure within the next 10 years. And so that poses fantastic opportunities for, you know, companies that operate in the UK construction sector, but you know, you wouldn't go near Myanmar at the moment because of that country and political risk and turbulence that's underway at the moment. So really important that you understand the risks associated with the country that you're looking to trade in. In terms of commercial risk, so you know, like I said, commercial risk exists in domestic markets too, but I suppose it is true that their impact in international markets is greater. So, you know, the changes in international markets can be more difficult to anticipate and predict. It can be a little bit more difficult to gauge the suitability and acceptability of your product on that international stage. And again, that's where that research becomes so important. Also, you know, variations in demand and supply conditions can be a little bit more unpredictable. And most of these, you know, these commercial risks are typically borne by the exporter, which is why some exporters can be put off. So, you know, some of the most commonly cited concerns by exporters I've listed here. You know, buyer insolvencies, you know, the buyer's inability to pay. You know, whether you as the exporter are able to actually supply the quantity or the quality of goods, and that's why, you know, commercial agreements are so very important. There are how could you say, there's always going to be risk, but all these risks can always be minimized by using, things like forecasting, keeping a careful watch on the changing business conditions and changes in the world economy. I can't underestimate the requirement for research. So plan, determine what your value add is, determine how you're going to differentiate, and where you sit in relation to local and international competitors is really important. So having that competitor matrix will help you position yourself really effectively in that market. And in international markets, just as in domestic markets, you're going to have both local and international competitors who are kind of influencing the demand and supply conditions. Local production of similar or competing products to yours might bring down prices, which mean that obviously has an impact on your export pricing and margin. Certain situations you might have the introduction of substitutes, which can impact on your share in the market. And then, why it's so important to understand government motivations as well is government intervention in certain sectors, the imposition or lowering of tariffs to boost or protect an economy can have a big impact on an exporter's potential within that market. So if you think about, we've said before on webinars that tariffs are very much a mechanism that governments use to either boost or protect their domestic economy. And when a government decides to intervene in a certain sector, so I think I've mentioned before about anti-dumping duties placed on Chinese silk that was being effectively dumped into India a good few years ago now, and kind of leveled the playing field and allowed those domestic manufacturers to cope. But that's the level of kind of government intervention that can happen, and that as an exporter into that market you need to be aware of and the implications of that. In terms of regulatory risk, so regulation is really classed as a non-tariff barrier risk. So things like changes to requirements to clear customs, or anything around product and packaging regulations and government procurement restrictions, and some of the more commonly cited ones I've listed here. So tariffs and trade policies, trade compliance, obviously export controls linked to licensing and so on. There might be the introduction of certain sector specific regulation, obviously environmental regulation as well. We see that within the EU, being our closest trading neighbour, Germany has very high environmental protections at a local jurisdiction level around packaging and so on. So, that will eventually replicate throughout the EU member state, and that gives us, considerations as UK exporters exporting to the EU. Lots of different things, on the regulatory front can impact your potential to be successful in that market. Ethical risk is an interesting one. So it is exactly as it says. It's kind of understanding your ethics as a company. So, what's your mission, your vision, your goals, your policies, and your strategies, and how do they fit with the country that you're looking to expand into? So you need to take account of those legal and ethical issues in international business. So, there are some countries that may pose a serious moral and ethical challenge for you, and whether or not you actually want to expand into those. So I've listed, some of the most common ethical issues in international business here. So, working standards and conditions, child labour, human rights and human rights violations, and so on. If you think about it, businesses trading internationally, as an exporter, you're expected to fully comply with all of the local regulations and laws and fiscal and monetary reporting statutes and so on. So they're a consideration, but also those cultural considerations can make or break a company that's looking to conduct business globally. So if you think about it, every culture and nation has its own history, its own customs, its own traditions and codes of ethics. And obviously, as we mentioned, going back a couple of slides, those cultural barriers include language, which often means that as an exporter, you might have to rely on translators when speaking to business contacts and customers. In some markets, gender can be an issue, where in some countries where women don't have the same rights as men, for example. Religious holidays and other cultural events can prohibit trade at certain times. You need to be aware of that kind of religious holiday and cultural events calendar and build that into your plan. And being seen to be in accordance with those ethical and cultural values is absolutely crucial for you as an exporter to win client support and for you to achieve that competitive advantage in that particular market. So you need to be absolutely aware of what those cultural norms are and be seen to be abiding by them by your customers in those markets. Intellectual property risk consideration. So I am not by any stretch of the imagination an IP specialist, and you should always seek specialist advice from the Intellectual Property Office, for example, or a suitable specialist. But a couple of things just to be aware of. So when you're thinking about your IP, so you're thinking about exclusivity, the right to prevent others from using and benefiting from your specific creation. You need to be thinking about territorial. So IP rights are territorial. They're only valid in the country or the region where they're granted. So you might have to manage several registrations, so you just have to look at the EU exit, for example, whereby the UK and the EU are now operating separate systems for trademarks and designs, for example, where the UK has had to copy over or grandfather over those EU trademarks. Obviously, copyright is outside of the scope, so that's automatically granted through provisions of the Berne Convention. But you need to be looking at things like freedom to operate. So can your company actually develop, make, market products without legal liabilities to third parties, so other patent holders, for example? You need to really respect the deadline. So once an application for a patent or design right has been made domestically, an international application has to be made within the priority period. So for patents, that's within 12 months, and for designs within 6 months. So that's really important. And protecting IP on the global stage is a little bit more intricate, as you can imagine, and a little bit more risky than just doing it at a domestic level. Dealing with partners, so where you're working with partners, you have to really clearly define IP ownership. So where you're developing a new product with a partner or establishing a joint venture, modifying design, packages or trademarks, have everything in writing, and seek legal advice if in any doubt. Choosing the trademarks, this is a really important one. We cover this in a couple of weeks' time when we look at expanding into emerging markets. Does that trademark have any undesired connotations, or could it be rejected in that country? So, when we think about cultural acceptance, we're not just looking at language, we're looking at colors, we're looking at imagery. So, sourcing support and advice from an international brand specialist, for example, would be money quite well spent. And then also regular audits. So this is something that, where you've got several different IP rights, you should be auditing them regularly. So making sure that they've been maintained, making sure that you're optimally exploiting them. Are any of them redundant? Is there any infringement, and so on? That's just good practice around intellectual property management. Okay, cargo risk. So obviously, there are a number of risks associated with cargo. So we can have contamination, we can have seizure, accident, vandalism, theft, loss, breakage. To be honest, transportation of cargo has undergone radical improvements over recent years. So global trusted trader schemes like Authorised Economic Operator, or AEO, as we've referred to before, really focuses on that safety and security of the supply chain. So we've seen massive improvements in terms of that lowering of cargo risk over recent years. But transit risks are a common hazard for those of us exporting and importing. So, anything from storms, collisions, theft, leakage, explosion, spoilage, fire, high sea robbery. It all sounds very dramatic, doesn't it? But they are all risks. Sorry. So every exporter should have a working knowledge of marine insurance to know whether they're getting the required risk protection at their minimum cost, so getting the best bang for the buck. And those principles of marine insurance are also equally applicable to the insurance of our air cargo as well. So regardless of whether it's air freight or sea freight, you need that insurance at that, to give you that adequate risk protection in the most cost-effective manner. Currency risk. So this is kind of linked to a country's economic stability. So high levels of government debt obviously can lead to inflation and currency destabilization. Can't talk today. Destabilization, I do apologize, but both of those are likely to have a real and significant impact on any company doing business in and with that country. So really important to have an appropriate exchange policy in place, because that helps you stabilize profit margins and mitigate the negative impacts of those fluctuating exchange rates on sales and procurements. Obviously, it enhances cash flow and simplifies that domestic and foreign pricing. There are a number of mechanisms that you can use for reducing the impact of sterling volatility and protecting those cash flows. So there are foreign bank accounts that you can open, so you can transfer funds to the UK when those exchange rates are more favourable. You can get involved in futures contracts, currency options. There's lots of stuff you can do, and it's really worthwhile thinking about it, because you just need a slight drop in the currency. So if you import goods in US dollars and the pound drops 10% against the dollar, your costs go up by 10%, which has a massive impact on cash flow and margin. And obviously with export, where there's a gap between an order being paid and payment being made, if there's any significant exchange rate fluctuation that happens within that period, your payment amount takes a hit. So that impacts on your cash flow and margin. So that kind of hedging and risk mitigation around currency risk is really, really important. Credit risk. So, when you're dealing with more emerging markets, it can be difficult to assess the credit worthiness of your customers. So that can lead you to feeling a little bit vulnerable, a little bit exposed. Obviously, it does happen, risk can arise due to inability of the buyer to pay on the due date. So not necessarily not pay, but just not pay in time, but that obviously has an impact on your cash flow. Or the buyer might make the payment, but situations might have changed in the buyer's country and the funds of the buyer don't reach the exporter. So, that's not that common, but can happen. Obviously, whatever the reason might be, if the funds are not received, then the sufferer is finally, you and I, the exporters. So we have to have mitigation strategies in place. And really, that's where that credit risk insurance is of immense help, because it kind of covers our exposure to those kind of risks on the international stage. Making sure you get paid, we're going to go into each one of these in a little bit of detail, but this is the payment risk diagram, and it has a spectrum in terms of the various different methods of getting paid on the internet, when trading internationally. And it shows kind of most secure for the exporter and least secure for the exporter, and vice versa. So as we go through, it might become a little bit clearer, but I just really like this diagram for visually illustrating it. So one of the ones that you'll come across most frequently for exporting for the first time to a new client or within a new country will be cash in advance or cash up front. So obviously it's most secure for us as the exporter because we have our goods before, we have our payment before the goods are shipped, but obviously it's not very attractive for the importer. So it helps us as exporters avoid those credit risks. it means that, that payment's received up front before the ownership of the goods is transferred. The most common methods of payment for this on an international stage would be like wire transfers and credit card payments. They're probably the most commonly used for cash in advance options. But this cash in advance presents the least risk to the seller, but the most risk to the buyer. So if you think about it, what guarantees does the buyer have that after they've made the payment, you are going to ship their goods, for example? And you could argue, well, the contract is robust and so on, but there may be things that are beyond your control and other external influences. So where we're requiring payment in advance, it's the least favourite option for the buyer. It's like I say, it generates that unfavourable cash flow, and it's difficult when traders don't know each other very well, and yet typically that's where it's used, where we don't have that trading history and that trust that's built up. I think also as exporters, what we have to be aware of is that when we're insisting on this payment method as the only manner of doing business, like not just for the first or the second shipment, then that could see us losing business to competitors who offer more attractive payment terms like lines of credit and so on. So we have to be mindful of that. Documentary collection. So in a documentary collection process, the seller instructs their bank to forward documents related to the export of goods to the buyer's bank, so the customer's bank, with an instruction to present those documents to the buyer for payment, kind of indicating when and on what circumstances the documents can be released to the buyer. So funds are received from the importer and transferred to the exporter through the banks involved in the collection in exchange for those documents. So documentary collections really involve using a draft that requires the importer to pay the face amount either at site, so that's what we call document against payment, or on a specific date, so that's what we call document against acceptance. And that collection letter gives instructions that specify the documents required for the transfer of the title of goods. So in documentary collection, if you think about the banks are acting as facilitators for their clients, but importantly, documentary collections don't offer a verification process, and they offer limited recourse. I really can't talk today. Limited recourse in the event of non-payment. So they definitely don't provide the same level of security as a letter of credit, which we're going to come on to in a second. But because they don't offer that level of security, then they're typically less expensive than a letter of credit, so they can be the preferred option for some exporters and importers. But letter of credit, as I say, it is very secure. It's one of the most secure methods of payment available to international traders. It's essentially a letter from a bank guaranteeing that the buyer's payment to a seller, so the importer's payment to the exporter, will be received on time and for the correct amount. So the buyer typically sets up, so the importer will typically set up credit and pay his or her bank for that service. So it's useful, really useful, when, as I said earlier, that credit worthiness information about a foreign importer just doesn't exist, or it's really difficult to secure. But where the exporter is satisfied with the credit worthiness of the buyer's foreign bank. And really, to be honest, why it's quite secure is it protects the buyer as well, as they don't need to make the payment until the goods have been shipped as promised, because the trust relationship is with the foreign bank. So letter of credit is incredibly secure. Open account, obviously, is where the sale, where the goods are shipped and delivered before the payment's due. So on international sales, that can be anything between 30, 60, 90 days, which obviously has an impact on cash flow. Obviously, this method is based on the trustworthiness between the two parties, because this is one of the most advantageous options to the importer in terms of that cash flow and cost, but it's consequently one of the most higher risk options for the exporter. But because of the high competition in export markets, those foreign buyers can often press us as exporters for those open account terms, because that extension of credit by an exporter to an importer is more common abroad. and will vary massively depending on the country that you're exporting to. So really, as an exporter, if we're not willing to extend credit at a certain point within the trade relationship, then we're potentially going to lose a sale to one of our competitors. If you know, where you're concerned about opening account terms and you know, offering competitive account terms, you can use something like export credit insurance for that extra protection, which will protect you against the risk of non-payment. So that's something that is well worth taking a look at. Consignment is another method of open account. It sees payment being made to the exporter only after the goods are sold by, say, that foreign distributor to the end customer. So it's probably the most risky option for an exporter. So an international consignment transaction is typically based on a contractual arrangement where the foreign distributor receives, manages and sells the goods for the exporter, but the exporter retains the title of the goods until they're sold. And so, as I said, it really contains a level of high risk for the exporter because their stock is in a foreign country and they haven't actually received any payment for it. But it is a very attractive option for the importer in the other country, and to be honest, it increases the chances of us as exporters to become more competitive because we have access to better availability and faster delivery of goods, which is a consideration. And obviously we're not covering the direct costs of storing and managing that inventory here in the UK. But it's only really advised where there is where the partner that you're dealing with is reputable and a trustworthy foreign distributor or third-party logistics provider. That's really essential, and it's typically once the relationship's established. Obviously, you need to have appropriate insurance in place to cover those consigned goods in transit or while they're in possession of a foreign distributor, as well as to mitigate against the risk of non-payment. So consignment, really interesting option in terms of maintaining competitiveness, but probably the most risky from an exporter's perspective. So when I'm talking, because put EU exit to one side, what the export department does is actually help brands expand overseas. So getting back to our exporting route, shall we say, we work with clients around overseas expansion planning. So we kind of work through this model here. So we look at things like business readiness. We explore a company's motivations for exporting. We look at their branding. Does it translate in the market that they're looking to penetrate? We look at the product readiness, their product readiness, or their service readiness even. So is it versatile? Can it be differentiated? What are the potential compliance issues that it might face in the local market? What kind of available in-house skills, knowledge, resources does the company have? And if they can't source them from internally, then where are they going to acquire those resources from and those skills? Looking at existing processes, so do they adapt to the local market requirements? We also examine their competitiveness. So, how competitive are they in their domestic market? Are they likely to face the same or a subset of their current competitors in the market that they're looking to export to? And if so, how do they differentiate in the domestic market, and can that be replicated? We look at capacity. That's really important. Like I say, export is a long game, but sometimes it can throw you. Something can take off a lot faster than you thought it could. And do you have the capacity to fulfill that overseas demand? And do you do that via existing inventory or other sources, for example? And then we look at financial situation. So does the company really have the ability to invest in those associated upfront costs that I mentioned earlier on? And how do they manage their cash flow? Are they particularly sensitive to exchange rate fluctuations and payment systems, so on? Export is a long game, but incredibly rewarding when you get it right. Then we look at market research. So, we examine what the potential for a client's product or service is in the target market. We look at things like GDP growth rate, GDP per capita, disposable income. They can all help indicate spending power in that market. We look at whether the company's product is, niche. Is it innovative? Is it, where can it be placed in that target market? And how do they reach that target market? What are the appropriate routes? Is it channel? Is it direct? What are the options open to the company for that product that they're looking to sell into that market? We also look really importantly at the legal and regulatory requirements within that target market, because they can make or break a brand's expansion overseas. You may just find that a regulatory regime just doesn't permit the selling of your product without massive adaptation that is just almost cost prohibitive. We look, going back to a good few slides at the beginning, we look at the market, how stable it is, looking at those economic and political considerations. Are there any cultural considerations to our clients selling in that market? What's the customer demographic? Are there any similar characteristics to their domestic market? And then going back to that competition. So, are you likely to come across those domestic competitors, local competitors, international competitors? Who are they? What are they offering? How do you differentiate alongside them? And then also we sometimes take a look at, I appreciate with COVID at the moment, there's not a lot of this going on, but quite often we'll explore things like exhibitions and trade missions that clients can take part in, because they can be a great way of testing your toes in the market and getting a feel for how your product's going to go. Available support and advice. We always signpost where possible our clients to free or subsidised support. So DIT offers an awful lot of stuff like that. They have some fantastic country guides. I'm looking at a few of them here on my shelf as I talk to you. We'll consult things like market reports, any kind of off-the-shelf research that we can get our hands on. Two of the most, we'll probably come on to it in a little bit, but two of the websites that we consult a lot are the Ease of Doing Business and the Corruption Perception Index, because that can give us a really good indication as to how favourable those local market conditions are for UK exporters. Risk analysis we've kind of talked about, but then we get into strategy and planning. So, determining the objectives of our clients. So what are they hoping to achieve in terms of sales, turnover, profitability? What routes to market? We're starting to firm up on the routes. So is it direct? Is it distributors or agents? Is it licensing, franchising, or setting up a local office? Is it all online? And obviously, depending on the stage that our clients at in terms of exporting, various ones may look more attractive than others. We're planning the financing. So, are they going to get a hold of any kind of debt financing? Are they going to use something like Bibby Financial and Export Finance around invoice financing? Risk mitigation is a big part of this strategy and planning. So, how are we going to put in place contingency plans, and how are we going to make sure that our clients can secure payment, that they're well protected against those exchange rate fluctuations, that they're able to access that credit worthiness or those credit references where possible, and have we done absolutely all we can do to make sure that the market is favourable for them in terms of that political, economic stability and so on. And then we'll look also around acquiring or developing the required skills. So the export department actually operates as kind of an outsourced export department for a number of companies. So we effectively plonk ourselves in that company and operate as their export department. So that's a way that they can increase their skills and their abilities, and obviously it's all about knowledge transfer over time. So our desired aim is that through working with companies that they kind of acquire those skills in-house, and we gradually step back as they take over. We look a lot at protecting intellectual property, and as I say, we're not experts, so we'll typically enlist the services of an IP specialist, or at least consult with the IPO. And then we explore things like, the provision of post-sales and support and service, which, you know, depending on your route to market, can be a little bit more challenging. How are you going to account for that? Lots of different things, you know, tax position, looking at the export pricing. So, you know, USPs, when we talk to clients about their USPs, what are your USPs in your domestic market? Fantastic. So you're speedy to get your products to customers, and you're the cheapest on the market. Those USPs don't translate very well to international markets, because there's typically a lengthier delivery timescale to getting goods to customers, so you might not be the fastest. And also you've potentially got additional costs, you know, linked to shipping the goods to that market. So you might not find that you are the most, you know, the least expensive. So how are you going to differentiate based on those kind of challenges? And then we also always establish a kind of export budget. So everybody's clear on how those initial expenses have to be allocated, and when you expect to see a return. Route to market, as I say, lots of different options there, and it's important that you explore all of them and understand the benefits and the limitations of each. And then market entry is just kind of, you know, an extension of the strategy and planning phase, where it gets very real and it gets very, very exciting. And that's really where we are, you know, adapting the product and the service to meet those local regulatory demands. You know, we're firming up on agreements with distributors if that's the way that we're going to go. We've got insurance in place around credit and cargo and so on, and it all starts to get very, very exciting. I'm just going to rush through some of these because I'm very, very conscious of time. But you know, when we're looking at assessing kind of risk in the market, so there are hundreds of factors to consider in international business when you're looking to embark on a new export opportunity. But you know, they can be broken down pretty much as economic, political, and then social and structural. So for the economic risk, you know, I've listed probably the most common ones here, and I think the overwhelming thing to remember is that you need to be carefully evaluating economic data by country to determine the risk. You know, you need to be really on top of that research. No country is immune to economic risk. I mean, just look at the UK and actually the globe with the COVID pandemic. You know, we could never have foreseen that and its impact globally. So it's really just about planning as much as you possibly can. You know, things like tax laws and interest rates and almost you know, changes in regime, you know, can impact international business dealings. So if you look at the 4-year Trump presidency, you know, it was kind of characterized by protectionism and not a very outward view of international trade. And we're going to see that flip back to Obama kind of attitude with the new Biden administration. So changes in regime can change the outlook of a country for your exports. It's really important that you just keep your finger on the pulse there. Kind of leading on from that, so you know, every country from the most to the least developed, there's always going to be some level of political risk. So like I said, you know, the US, one of the most developed nations, we've seen quite a bumpy last 4 years. It's just really important that you are you know, that you're aware of the obvious signs of instability, like I mentioned earlier about Myanmar, like a coup or war, or, you know, what do those political risks look like? And, you know, I was trying to think about how to link it in with regulation. I suppose where you get a shift from less to more regulation, so greater state ownership of certain industries or more government involvement in the economy, that can represent a political risk as well. So, you know, if there's all of a sudden a nationalisation strategy of utilities, for example, that can, if you're a company that's selling into those sectors, that can make that country seem less attractive. So really just important to keep your fingers on the pulse here. Structural risk. So these are kind of structural and social factors, really need close inspection. So those structural factors include any fixed elements within the country that can impact economic performance, and I've listed some of them here. So, that kind of social infrastructure, labour force, competitors, export regulations is obviously a big one, but a number of them here to really consider when you're doing a risk mitigation strategy. Other factors to consider. So I did say just before, two of the websites that we consult in Ango when we're doing our kind of market research are the Corruption Perceptions Index and the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, where they rank countries on the global stage according to their ranking in terms of corruption, so how corrupt they are, and similarly with the World Bank, how easy to do business with them are they? So, how easy is it to clear goods at customs? How easy is it for you to set up a legal entity in that market? And so on. There's various different matrices that they use to come up with that ranking. But the two are really, really important. And we touch on quite a bit of this in a couple of weeks' time when we look at expanding into those emerging markets, because they really come into their own there. Contracts and T's and C's. So with everything that I've talked about today about risk mitigation and so on, having those robust contracts and trade and condition terms and conditions, forgive me, is really, really important and can go a long way to mitigating risk. So, the core components really are, as I've listed them here. So who's the principal, who's the agent, a clear definition of the products or services to be provided. Importantly, and I feel like I've been going on about Incoterms for months now, but what are the Incoterms that you're going to ship those goods under? Again, Incoterms just apply to the shipment of goods, not services. But, who's going to be responsible for this shipping? Who's going to be responsible for the risk and so on? And where does that risk pass from the seller to the buyer? So Incoterms are imperative to include in those contracts as well as on those commercial invoices. What are the payment terms and retention of title? And when does that transfer of title happen? Are there any guarantees and waivers offered within the contract? Timelines for delivery, being mindful that particularly when we're talking about international supply chains and so on, they can be impacted by a wide range of factors. What contingency do you build in there? What happens if either party fails to deliver or pay, or they want to terminate the agreement, or they're in breach of contract and so therefore the agreement needs to be terminated? What happens? This is absolutely those contracts and terms and conditions. Really, you need to seek proper legal advice to protect you there. And importantly, what's the law that's governing the contract? So ideally, you'd want it to be the law of England and Wales, but does that work for both parties that are, party to that contract? So contracts and terms and conditions are so important. And then in terms of additional support and information, as always, there's a couple of slides here that have links to the relevant signposting for additional information. So I think somewhere in here, yes, we've got World Bank Ease of Doing Business and Transparency Org's Corruption Perception Index. Obviously, you've got access to your local growth hubs. I would urge you to use them. You may go full circle and you may end up back with the export department, but I've also given our website address there. DIT as well, for those of you aware, DIT has an internationalization fund offering grants for exporters for certain types of activity. So that might be something that you might want to look into. So if you don't currently have an international trade advisor to work with, then please try and find out who your local one is. I know for Business Lincolnshire it would be Mike Stokes. For Business Gateway it's Anne Cook. Can't quite recall D2N2, but do get on their radar, because they're going to be the ones that can best signpost you to that kind of funding. And yes, I think that's really it from me, to be honest. Obviously quite a lot to take in. I'm just taking a quick look to see if we've got any Q&As or anything in the chat. It always concerns me with you guys when you don't ask any questions, because I think I've either covered it off perfectly or you're all just catching 5 minutes snooze. But if there are really no questions, then I will leave it there. But this has been recorded this afternoon, so we will upload a copy of the recording to YouTube, and then we'll send out the recording and also the slides, so you've got them to refer back to. Do join us in a couple of weeks' time, where we are talking about some of those overseas markets, those really exciting emerging markets that I've talked about today. They are so exciting. And we're going to be talking about those and how you can mitigate the risk when approaching some of those and looking to break into some of those. But if there really are no questions, then I will leave it there and just say thank you very much again, everybody, for joining me, and take care, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. Bye, everyone. Bye.